If your two-stroke exhaust has become excessively smoky and your bike has done a high number of hours, the most likely cause is the crankshaft oil seal on the clutch side is leaking and the engine is burning the transmission oil. The crankshaft oil seal is located in this area behind the clutch case, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to change the seal on my 2017 KTM 250 XC, which has done 368 hours. Here you can see all the parts I'm going to be changing. This is the crankshaft oil seal, and a couple of weeks ago someone called Chris contacted me and said he was having problems installing this. It needs to be driven into the case this way, and it's very easy to get it canted, and if it gets canted and you continue driving it in, you'll typically damage the oil seal and need to get a new one and try again. So Chris asked me whether I had a tool to install this, and I don't, so that got me thinking, and I decided to make a video and also develop a tool to install it. So if I quickly go through all the parts, other than the oil seal, I've got a new distance sleeve which sits inside the oil seal. It's a good idea to replace this because it can get worn, and it's quite a bit of work changing it out, so you might as well get a new one of those. Also a new O-ring which sits below the distance sleeve. So the actual oil seal on the crank is formed between the O-ring, the distance sleeve and the seal. And so it's a good idea to replace all three of those parts. I've also got a new lock washer for the primary gear, so I'm going to be replacing that. And because you have to take the clutch off, I'm actually going to be replacing my clutch with a new clutch pack. So you can see the new fiber plates soaking in oil, ready for installation. And I've got the steel plates here. I've also got some rubber dampers for the inner clutch hub, which I'm going to be replacing. And I've got a new lock washer for the clutch hub. If you don't need replacing your clutch yet, then obviously you don't need those parts. But maybe a good idea to replace the clutch rubbers, and certainly you'll need a lock washer. My current clutch has got just over 180 hours on it, so it's a good time to change the clutch. And if your crankshaft seal is leaking, this is the clutch side one, it's likely that the stator side seal is also probably not in good shape and require changing as well. So I've got a new one here. I'm not going to show that in this video, but you should think about changing that as well. And I'll put the part numbers of all these parts in the description of the video. And the first step is to drain the transmission oil. I'm using the Tokyo Offroad oil drain tool, which really helps minimize any mess. And I have a TMD skid plate mounted, which wraps around the engine both sides, so I'm going to need to remove this. And to remove the clutch case, I need to remove the power valve linkage cover, which is behind the pipe, so I need to take the silencer and pipe off as well. And I should note that I did wash the bike before I started working on it. Behind the pipe it's still got some dirt, so I'm going to clean that off before I go any further. I don't want any dirt dropping down when I take the case off, so I'm being careful to remove any dirt. Okay, next I'm going to drain the coolant, and the coolant is drained from this bolt. It's easy to spot because it's got a copper washer on it. I've still got the radiator cap on, and the reason being that when you remove the bolt, if you don't have the radiator cap on, the coolant comes out very forcibly. So with the cap still on, and I've got a container below it, and just remove the bolt, and only a tiny little bit of coolant should come out. And then you can place your funnel with your container and then remove the cap. And this way you minimize any spillage. Okay, next I'm going to remove the kickstarter. And next I'm going to remove the rear brake. It covers some of the bolts on the case, so it would make it somewhat difficult to remove the case. Okay, next I'm going to remove this coolant hose. Okay, now I'm ready to remove the power valve cover. Next I'm going to remove the power valve linkage clip which holds this onto the ball. And the clip could drop down into here, so I'm going to use a cloth and cover that area and then just pry off the clip, and it flips around like that and then pulls down, and then you can carefully pry the linkage off. Next I'm going to remove the water pump cover. And you should note that the water pump cover bolts are all different lengths, so I made this little template to keep track of where the bolts go. You can save yourself a lot of time when you're reassembling everything, rather than trying to have to figure out which one goes where. Next I'm going to remove the power valve adjuster cap and spring. Okay, so I've leant the bike over on its side and I'm ready to take the clutch case off. It's held on with 11 bolts. I've made a template so I can hold the bolts easily and know where to put them back in. And I'm going to start taking the bolts out. Initially I'm just going to loosen them to avoid any warpage of the case. So I'll just go around and loosen them a little bit and then start undoing them. Okay, I've removed all the bolts and I'm going to take the case off. And you're meant to ensure that the Kickstarter shaft remains in the case. So and then lift it up. It came off pretty easily. Okay, next I'm going to remove the clutch pack. I do have a video on the clutch, and I'll put a link to that video in the description, and that goes into real detail about how to remove the clutch, how to look at the clutch plates and determine whether you need a new clutch, and then the installation as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the clutch and the installation in this video. So once you remove the bolts, you can take off the Belleville spring, and there's a pre-tension ring as well. And what's important about this is it's directional. So the top surface is marked top. So you want to make sure the top mark is facing out. And then you can lift off the pressure plate. And you can remove the throw out. And then you can remove the clutch plates. So I find using a pick is really helpful. And I keep all the clutch plates in order. Okay, then you want to remove the dowels. And the next step is to remove the primary drive nut. And you should note this is a left-hand drive, so it's a reverse thread. And to undo it, you need to hold the primary drive in place. And I'm going to use a tool made by Motion Pro, which locks the primary gear to the hub. So you insert your tool. And make sure it's engaged properly. And then the nut is held on with Loctite, and it's also torqued to 150 Newton meters. So it's going to be pretty tight, so you need a fairly long breaker bar to remove it. So remembering it's left-hand drive, so you're turning it the opposite direction to you normally would, you can undo it. And it wasn't too bad with this breaker bar. And next I'm going to remove the clutch hub, and it's got the lock washer, so you need to pry that down. And the lock washer here you should never reuse. Once it's been bent once, it significantly weakens when you bend it back, so it'll probably snap off if you try and use it again, so definitely use a new one. Okay, so now I'm going to take the clutch hub nut off, and I've got my holder which I made myself. You can buy similar clutch holder tools. And I'm using a breaker bar, and the nut is torqued to 100 Newton meters, so it's quite difficult to take off. Also it has a thread lock, so you should be aware of that. Okay, so I just lifted off the inner hub, and now you can remove the outer hub. And then you can remove the primary gear. And now you can see the crank oil seal. Okay, next I'm going to remove the distance sleeve. And next I'm going to remove the crankshaft oil seal, and I'm going to use this oil seal puller tool. You should be very careful in how you position it to make sure you don't scratch anything. And it's coming out now, and there it is. And the other part I'm going to replace is the O-ring down here. So just use a pick tool and take that off. Okay, so now I'm ready to start reassembling everything, and before I do, I'm going to check I don't have any dirt or debris in there, and you also want to check the inside of the seal area and make sure there's no scratches or anything. If you do have some minor scratches, one thing you can do is when you install the seal is apply some medium strength Loctite around the outside, just a small amount, and then press it in, and that'll seal it and make sure there's no oil leaks. Mine looks really good, there's nothing there, so I'm just going to press that straight in. But first I'm going to install the new O-ring, so I'm going to use a little bit of oil just to lube it up a bit to minimize the risk of any tearing when I install it. And then you just want to press it down, and I'm going to use a pick tool carefully just to get it over the lip here. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the new seal, and I'm going to be using this new Tokyo Offroad crankshaft oil seal press tool, and the seal just sits on this part and keeps it centered, and it has a bore here which locates on the crankshaft and stops the seal getting canted while you're pressing it in. So I'm going to lube up the seal with some oil, just run it around the inside surface, and then push it onto the tool so it just snaps into place. And you can see here it has the press tool has an edge or lip which extends out beyond the seal, which will stop it being pressed in too far. And then you can locate the seal in the case, so you want to make sure it's centered properly. And once you're certain that it's centered, you can start driving it in. And I'm going to use the plastic end of a hammer and carefully drive it in. Okay, that's looking good. It needs a tiny little bit more just to make it flush. And I can hear it, the seal tool is bottoming out on the case now. So that should be fine. And you can see there, it's perfectly flush, installed really nicely. Okay, so next I'm going to install my new distance sleeve, and if you look carefully there's a beveled edge and a square edge, and the beveled edge goes in. So I'm going to apply a little bit of oil to this as well, and then just push it in. Okay. So that's all looking good. Okay, so now I'm ready to put the primary gear on, and if you have a 2017 or later two-stroke, it has this balancer shaft, and it's extremely important to align it with the primary gear. So if you look carefully on the primary gear, on one tooth there's a dot, and on the balancer there's a dot here, and you've got to line those up. If you don't line them up, the balancer's not going to do its job properly, and that lovely, smooth, vibration-free engine feeling will be gone. So make sure you line these up and double check, triple check it's lined up. And while I'm here, I'm going to point out the idler gear used for kickstarting. On the 2017 models, there's a issue with the case breaking off if you use the Kickstarter a lot. And there's a workaround and modification of installing a longer bolt here. And I've gone ahead and done that, and I'm going to be releasing a separate video showing how to do that. So I'm not going to cover that in this video. And next I can install the outer clutch basket. Should go on fairly easily. If it doesn't go on initially, don't force it, just wriggle it a little bit to engage with the primary gear. And then there's a spacer which fits on. And then you can install the inner clutch hub. And I've already put the clutch holder tool on. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the clutch hub nut, and I've got my clutch holder installed with the dowels holding it in place. And first you need to put in a new lock washer. Never reuse the old one because the tabs will break off once they're bent. And then the nut needs to be torqued to 100 Newton meters, and the manual states you need Loctite 648, so I'm going to use that. And then install the nut. And then torque the nut to 100 Newton meters. And then you need to bend up the tabs on a lock washer, and I initially use a screwdriver just to get it started. And then when it's slightly bent up, you can use some plier wrenches like this. These are Keihin and work very well. Okay, next I'm ready to install the primary drive nut, and I've got a new lock washer, so I'm going to put that on. And the primary drive lock nuts needs to be torqued to 150 Newton meters. I'm going to use some Loctite 648, which is specified in the manual. So I'll apply some to the thread. And then install it. And this is a left-hand thread, so be aware of that. And then I'm going to install my lock tool. So this is the same tool I used to undo it. Make sure it's engaged in the gears. And my regular torque wrench, it doesn't have a reverse setting, so I'm using this AC Delco torque adapter, and I've set the sound to 150 Newton meters, so I don't have to look at it while I'm torquing it, and hopefully that should be relatively easy. Okay, so that beeped, and it should be torqued. And then you can remove the lock tool. So I've got all new gaskets, so I'm going to remove these old gaskets now. And then on the clutch case gasket, there's 3 dowels, so there's one here, and one here, and be very careful not to lose those. Then once you've removed the gaskets, it's a good time to inspect the sealing surfaces and make sure they're clean and don't have any scratches or debris. So I'm just going to wipe these off with a cloth. And on the power valve gasket sealing surface, I've got a tiny little bit of gasket material left over, so I'm going to use this KTC ceramic gasket scraper just to remove it. And it comes off very easily. Okay, so now I can install my new gaskets. Just make sure the case gasket goes over the dowels. Okay, that looks good. And next I'm going to install the clutch pack, and I cover this in detail in my DDS clutch inspection and replacement video, so be sure to check that out because I'm going to skip over this and show you it assembled. And one important thing to note is when you put the pre-tension ring on, it has a top mark, so that needs to be up. And I'm installing this in position number 2, which is the middle position. Okay, now I'm ready to torque it, and I'm torquing to 6 Newton meters. Okay, now I'm ready to install the clutch case, and I've inspected the sealing surfaces to make sure they're clean, and I'm ready to put it on. So you have to get the power valve linkage, put it through there, and I also put some silicone grease on the Kickstarter shaft seal just to help it install and hopefully not tear while I'm installing it. And while you're doing this, because it's quite a large case, make sure it lines up correctly and seats on the dowels. And if it's not going on, don't start hammering it. It should go on very easily. And I just felt it half pop on there. Still needs a little bit of work up here. And it's popped right on now, so that looks as though it's lined up all the way round, and the gap looks good as well, so that's good. Next I can install the clutch cover screws, and because I made this template, it's very easy for me to check where they all go. And the clutch cover screws need to be torqued to 10 Newton meters. And next I can install the power valve control spring. Make sure it's seated correctly in there. And the cap screws, the torque is 5 Newton meters, so be careful not to over torque them. And next I can install the power valve linkage, so it goes onto this ball here. So you just need to press down firmly until it clicks. And then the clip has a hole and slides up, and then you just push it round and it engages here. The important thing is to make sure this is pushed onto the ball fully. Okay, then next you can install the power valve cover and make sure the sealing surfaces are clean, and then press it on. And this uses 3 Torx screws. And then you can torque the cover screws to 6 Newton meters. Okay, now I'm ready to install the water pump cover. Make sure the sealing surfaces are clean and the gasket is clean. And there's 2 dowels, so make sure those are in place. And then I made a template for these screws, so I know where they go. And the water pump cover screws are torqued to 10 Newton meters. Next I'm going to install the water pump hose. And next I'm going to install the Kickstarter, and the splines. I like to apply some anti-seize to them because the Kickstarter can get a little bit corroded and very difficult to take off. So a little bit of anti-seize on there really helps. And then decide the position that you like. I like mine up here so it doesn't interfere with the pipe. And then use some medium strength Loctite. And this needs to be torqued to 25 Newton meters. And reinstall the rear brake. Reinstall your skid plate. And the final step is to reinstall the pipe and silencer. And refill the coolant, and you'll also need to bleed the air from the cylinder head. So here you can see the bleed screw. So you just loosen this off and wait for water to come out. Okay, that's all the air. Just got coolant coming out now, and then you can retighten it. Okay, so that's the crankshaft oil seal replacement finished. I've put 675 milliliters of oil into the transmission. So I'm ready to start the bike and test that the clutch works okay. So put the choke is on. And the clutch is working fine, so great. I'm going to be riding on Sunday, so hope to have a good ride.